Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Turning Over the Tables Theological Roundtable. I am Gordon Rankin, the conference minister for the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ. In yesterday's roundtable, you heard us mention that we would like to have a whole month to explore the depth of the Holy Week story. We don't have a whole month's worth of these, but we are going to have a whole week of these theological roundtables. This is the second in our series, and these will be shared via our conference weekly news every day, starting on Palm Sunday and going through Easter. They will also be shared every day, likewise, on the conference Facebook page. There are other ways that you will have availability to them. These will also be posted on the conference website and on our conference YouTube channel. So you'll have plenty of chances to interact with our theological roundtables. The intent of our roundtables is to provide a little extra content and inspiration for those of our churches during this very sacred week that's bound to be a bit of a different week for us as we make our way through this Holy Week, keeping our social distance from one another. So with the understanding of how we will be using these roundtables, I want to confirm with our panel of theologians today that they are willing to allow their words and their wisdom to be shared with our churches in this way. Is this okay with all of you?
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Very good. So having done that, since you've agreed, I will actually take a moment to introduce you so people who know who we have on our panel today. So we have the Reverend Andy Jepton, who is the interim pastor at the Bartlett Congregational Church, UCC. We have the Reverend Lisa Stedman, who is the interim pastor at the Deerfield Community Church, United Church of Christ. We have the Reverend Gail Murphy, who is minister at large, sent out by the Congregational Church of North Barnstead to minister to those who don't go to church. And we have the Reverend Dr. Deborah Roof, pastor of First Parish Congregational Church, UCC in East Derry. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Gordon.
So our topic today, as I set up front, is the story of the turning over of the tables in the temples. And we are going to listen to the Lucan account of that scripture as taken from Luke 19:45 through 48, reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Then he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there. And he said, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were still spellbound by what they heard. So to step ourselves into this story, the timing of this story is actually one that happens differently in the different Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story gets recorded, of the cleansing of the temple gets recorded very early in the Holy Week part of the scriptures. But in the Gospel of John, this story actually is recorded as one of the very first acts of Jesus' ministry right after the wedding at Cana. Now, there are scholars who believe that this could be two separate incidents. Does the placement of this story in the gospel narrative have an effect for you on your understanding of the story and what you believe it means to our faith?
We're all hesitating to be polite, but I'll be the least polite of all of us. My conception of this is, given when the Gospels were written, and that Luke and the other synoptics were earlier in timeline of when they were written than the Gospel of John. My concept of this is that they placed it where it actually happened in Jesus' ministry, with the understanding that Holy Week is a week for us in the way that we conceive it,
Mhm.
but that it was not a week in Jesus' time. That in fact, people came to Jerusalem for the Passover, sometimes weeks and weeks ahead of time. And so my concept of this is that Jesus was there in Jerusalem for some time before Passover actually happened. And in that time period, he was going to the temple and teaching. And this is what happened early on in that time, which might have been 1 week as we conceive it, but I think of it more like 3 or 4 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks anyhow. And I also think of those as the most active days of his ministry, the very most public days of his ministry. And so when I think of it that way, I understand its placement in the synoptics as chronological, but I understand its placement in John as this was important. This is an indicator of who Jesus was. So as John was being written and edited later on in history, they said, this is an icon of what Jesus was like. And so they placed it earlier in the gospel as they were editing it. That's just my take. So I kind of think of it as same, different perspective from the gospels.
I'll piggyback on that. Lisa said different perspectives. So I think the placement has more to do about the gospel writer than it does about Jesus. The John's ethos was completely different from Luke and Mark. Luke and Mark specifically use almost the same words, and they needed to portray that there was this undercurrent building against Jesus. And in this particular act, Jesus fed into the reason to, the justification to get rid of this angry guy. So it was more about what they were bringing forward. But in both cases, I think it's really important that we recognize. I'm frozen, am I frozen?
No, we still hear you.
Super. Gosh, you're all spellbound. Woo!
Absolutely.
Just like the scripture said, spellbound.
We're hanging on every word.
Oh my gosh, what was I saying? I really did forget what was.
You were saying it was a matter of perspective.
Perspective, yeah. And that we're completely human. We have all these aspects of humanity. Jesus had all those aspects of humanity. The wedding at Cana, grace upon grace, the abundance, and let's call out injustice when it happens, and let's get angry. So they're both they both have their place.
I think listening to that and thinking of exactly that we talk about the Son of God and the Son of Man, and depending upon what you're listening to and whose interpretation of who Jesus is, sometimes after you've heard of a lot of it, it's a little hard to believe that, are we talking about somebody who is God, somebody who is man, and what does that mean? By golly, when he gets mad there in the temple and is ready to trash it just to get rid of what needed to get rid of because of this misuse, just completely missing the idea of what is supposed to be going on in a temple. And he was pretty human in his reaction. He got angry. There was nothing, shall we say, godlike about that, although we know that God certainly gets angry, but he acted it out, and he was a living lesson of what it means to be a human being who is offended by what is going on around him or her. So I didn't have any trouble at all seeing a difference of when this happened, what was happening. This was being passed on by human beings, and who perhaps all, in thinking about it, what we're worried about, what's recorded in John at a time of how many, 70 years ago, 60, 70 years after the Gospel of John was written, somewhere in there. I don't know what the latest work on the age of it, but it's certainly a long period of time has gone by, and the lesson that has come through is that the people who are in charge of worship and the people who are to carry on the activities of the temple and of worship and of celebrating the important days in the history of the religion, he certainly has touched on something by having Jesus really having and telling the story, so that he is just about as angry as he is any place that we see him, read about him any place. And I think whether it's told here, from there, and all of that, we can also count on the fact that if everybody's talking about it, we're going to have a lot of different versions of when it happened and why it happened and what he said and so on and so forth. So I think it was as good an example of Jesus' humanity, or human acting out of a sacred anger, not just, boy, he isn't doing a very good job there, but being
Righteous anger.
Pardon me? A righteous anger.
Righteous.
Yeah.
And that was just about what was needed. And so I think no matter when we say it was translated and said it was set into stories that are now being told, it makes a point that is needed, I think, and shows them as being angry, not just at some of the things that ordinary individuals did, that he comes in face to face with as he is ministering, but that's the one who says, oh, he's not just hanging there and somebody's and putting up with any way of preaching the party line. He's going to get it right, and I think that's just fine. It doesn't make much difference to me who says it. When it happens, the point is made.
And I've thought about that, and I think that the placement of it was probably purposeful, that in John, Jesus was just starting his ministry, and it seemed to me that if his first miracle was that wonderful, at the wedding, joyful, abundant, extra kind of thing, the next thing that happens is a way to establish that Jesus isn't just this foofy, make everybody happy kind of a thing, but this is an important way to establish the fullness of who Jesus was as the Son of God, I think. But that when it happens in Luke, it happens more as the culmination of his, this is, whether, Lisa, it's, several weeks, but that week was the end, and that it was important that, that the ending culminated in a challenge of the power of the temple, the misuse of the temple. And so to me, there is a different purpose of putting it at the beginning and at the, I don't know that the message is that much different, but that was the significance to me about where it was placed.
Well, I'm going to agree to a certain extent with you by saying that, if I may, that anybody who's writing something that wants to have some power to it needs to know how you put the events together. And that's a much better culmination to everything, no matter why it's there in the right place or the wrong place. Reading it, and it has a power there that it would not have had. And you'd have wondered, I wonder how long they're going to put up with somebody like that who's going to be that fussy right away.
Well, and that contentious for his view of justice and righteousness. That's this is one of my favorite Jesuses. When when I picture Jesus in this role, he's the closest in my visual imaging to John the Baptist, his cousin, that he ever is, because he goes, you can see Jesus the wild man, like John was, and you can just kind of imagine him tearing at his hair and kind of, pulling at his clothes in his distress as he turns over those tables and as he shouts and throws people out, and that kind of wild dramatic action of a guy who has lost it in his righteous anger is a wonderful image to me, because it does contrast, Gail, with the nice Jesus who made the water turn into wine at Cana, and the nice Jesus.
So let's drill down for a moment on this Jesus. In this story, in the scripture that we read, Jesus rants against those who are selling in the temple, but it's really clear this wasn't really a rant against commerce itself. Rather, those who would come to make sacrifices were being sold animals that had to have a certain purity, or they were having to exchange coin because you couldn't offer the coin of Rome at the temple. And those who were doing the selling were providing such things at a significant markup. Jesus' rant was about exploitation. What learnings do we draw from this Jesus we've been talking about, as Jesus does speak out against such exploitative behavior?
What struck me is how easy it is for a good idea to get corrupted. That I think we know that that if people are coming from all over, they needed some place to get their sacrifice, or to do what they needed to do. That's valid, but when it becomes exploitive, when it becomes distracting from the worship, then it becomes something less than what it should be. And it just made me reflect on how easy that is to happen to anything, that churches have such good intentions, people of faith have such good intentions, but sometimes by just doing it again and again, we lose how important it is, or it gets opened up to, we've got to use this as a fundraiser because we are not surviving financially or whatever. But good ideas that can come from very faithful places get corrupted.
I think that's one of the things about systems. When things get institutionalized and systematized, that's a real danger, that the privileged, those in power who set up the system or somehow are supporting the system, get more privileged, and the oppressed get more oppressed. And that's what that exploitation is about, is it privileges the already privileged and oppresses the already oppressed, just driving those two groups of folks further apart and further into their respective places. And I think too often our systems get going and that's where they grind to. And good people with good ideas, you can imagine that certainly applies today as well. And I mean today and today in our lives.
What it made me think of was the case of toilet paper that I have in the garage to sell to any one of you.
When is the bidding starting?
So and that is the first thing I thought of, was the toilet paper. And then I hear my beloved Gail, who says how good people sometimes get caught up and then the system gets perverted. And I went right to, I'm sorry, but there's some really dishonest people that walk right into a system of good people and take advantage.
Mm.
And, you know, how many times do we read, wake up, awaken, watch out, look, and pay attention. I mean, you mentioned John the Baptist, and those images are going through my head. Turn toward God. So it can happen. So it's so insidious. It's so, we have to pay attention to whether it's the bad people sneaking in and Zoom bombing our conversation, or selling or buying too much toilet paper, or whether it's the good people who get too caught up in the system, the idolatry rather than the religiosity rather than the spirituality. So it's a great lesson of waking up.
Nice.
I did a little bit of reading before today's session, and in the Interpreter's Bible, they talked about how Jesus often would teach with an action paired with a teaching. And to me, this is the ultimate of that story. And as you explained that, Deborah, that became clear to me, that the action was the turning over of the tables, but the teaching was about, you know, the misuse of concepts, the abuse of people, the evilness that's out there, the justice that is not being done.
Right. You take something that's necessary for good folk and you pervert it into a money-making operation.
Yeah.
So I'm to build on where we're going with this. Clearly in the story, there is this mutually beneficial relationship between those who are selling in the temple and the leadership of the temple. If the leadership in the temple was calling this out, clearly the sellers wouldn't be there doing the same thing. Jesus comes into this sacred place and reminds them that this is a house of prayer, not a den of robbers. As the church today, are we confident that we are strictly a house of prayer, or are there things as church or as religion today that still need to be cleansed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as an interim pastor, I really want to leap on this, because the new church profile, and I still think of it as the new church profile, even though it's been the church profile for a number of years, but it's based on 3 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we as a church? Who is our neighbor as a church? And who is God calling us to be? And I think that asks us to clarify, maybe not cleanse, but to clarify who we are and what our purpose is. I see the church that I'm serving right now really working hard to understand that. Who are we? Okay, this is the reality of who we are. Who's our neighbor? Oh, we can think about this differently than what we've thought about it in the past. And then who is God calling us to be, which is the portion of the profile that the church is working on right now. And I see them asking themselves these questions. What is our focus? Is this within our focus? You know, is this true to our purpose and to our theology and our philosophy? It's funny, I find myself thinking of clarifying and even purifying more than I do cleansing. And that's just a thing for me. But it helps me to think of the fact that as a church, we always need to be clarifying our purpose and whether or not we're living to that.
Mhm.
Well, I will build on this question in a way that I haven't prepared you for yet, but we'll see if we can go this direction. I had seen on Facebook the other day one of the youth from my very first church who's gone on and now spent years being a brother and pastor, wrote the statement that this has been the lentiest Lent in the history of Lent.
I saw that. That is so cool.
Like
Oh, I
that.
love that.
And I wrote back saying, the scary thing is I know exactly what that means.
Yes. Yep.
Lent in and of itself is a type of cleansing. I mean, it's a season of fasting. We do things differently. We clean out some stuff that distract us from our attention to our relationship with the divine during this season. I think the realities we're facing as we're in this season of COVID-19 are Lenten for us. They are having us choose to do some things differently because the way we usually do them isn't working right now.
Mhm.
And I wonder, I'm going to pick up Lisa's term, I wonder what that's going to clarify for us about being for the church of the future.
Yes.
Is there some Lenten action that is happening during this time that's going to make us a new church?
Mhm.
We can pray that, yeah.
Right.
I almost certainly think that we are going to be forever transformed, and that not only Lent, but also Easter are going to take on fairly radical new meanings as we come through this and live into whatever is next.
Mhm.
I don't see how we can go back and be the same as we have been.
So to pick up on that, this experience is almost a clarifying experience.
Mhm.
And it is, I have used the term catapult. It has catapulted the church finally from the 1950s to the 21st century. And so all of a sudden, we caught up to the world. And when we can worship together in the same place again, I think it'll be a both and. Many of us will continue to do virtual outreach because we're reaching people.
Yeah.
And God is just doing an amazing thing from that point of view.
Yeah.
And in the context of this story, Lisa, you said that a part of your job as an interim UC is to help them clarify and to cleanse. But when is the time where we need to overturn the tables? And really, how much of this sort of naturally is going to happen because we've experienced something new, we've seen God work in different ways that we're willing to embrace. But when we go back, are there tables that we need to turn over and really challenge beyond what we've experienced?
It's funny, last year I used this scripture passage on one of the Sundays of Lent, and I remembered that as we were preparing for today, and I went back and because my church streams worship already every week and has done so for years, has nothing to do with me, has everything to do with this church. I went back to look at last year's worship service. I had forgotten that we had a set in the sanctuary, at the front of the sanctuary, and that when we started talking about this scripture passage, I went up onto the altar area and tore apart the set literally flipped a table over and turned a chair over, and we pulled down the banner that had been put up. We pulled it down. And a couple of people said to me afterwards, well, that was dramatic. For me, it was absolutely traumatizing to ruin the set, but also to see how horrified people were in the sanctuary there as I, tore the thing apart. And people were really shaken in a way that I hadn't anticipated. And it makes me think about this passage and think about how upended things, Jesus made things in that time, and how upended we are now, because we're in an upside down, topsy-turvy time. And
life has clearly flipped our set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in this passage, it wasn't just for that effect. And my sense, Lisa, that was not just an effect for you, but that really was to set the stage for somebody to open up to something new. And it seems like, the passage ends with that Jesus went on teaching at the temple, and that the people responded hugely, even as the temple leaders did not.
Yes. And in fact, the attentiveness, depending on which translation you look at, that the people were listening, or were attentive, or were hanging on his every word, is the way one translation puts it. That's what prevented the leaders from being able to do anything about Jesus at that moment, was that the people were so drawn in by his action and his words.
The NRSV uses the word spellbound.
Yes.
And I was fascinated because I didn't remember. I'm doing the narrative lectionary, and everybody's amazed. They're always amazed, and they're awestruck. And you do a word search on amazed and awestruck and Mark, and there's dozens. But spellbound, and so it only happens twice in the Gospels, that word, and it's the same story. Luke and Mark both use the word spellbound. And that it's different. It has a different, that it brings in that idea of the power that he had over people's attention. They were drawn in mystically, magically, under his spell, so to speak. Really got his attention by this particular action. And how amazing must it have been for the people who were being cheated? The victims of the system who were, whoa, he cares that much?
Right.
To do something so dramatic. It's very poignant, very deep.
So to focus in for a moment, I believe it was Andy who talked about this giving us a picture of an angry Jesus. And I think this scripture, as much as any, I think there's some other places where Jesus is angry, but this is the one that presents this in the fullest picture, I think. How does this moment of anger affect your understanding of Jesus and the message that Jesus has for us?
When I see something like that seems to be such a human thing, not holier than thou. It's a human emotion, and it's got strength to it. I think what Jesus is saying sometimes is all of us are in charge of the way we approach God and we honor God with who we are and what we do with our lives. And we need to have not just the nice emotions, but the willingness to care enough to do something out of, and especially as clergy, out of what is expected of us, how we expect to act. Maybe we need to get out of the role that is assigned to us and the way it's always been practiced, and decide to do something different that recognizes the call of God to all of us to be people who are fully serving God, not because of a title, not because of a particular education, but because of understanding that each of us is uniquely able to serve God. Out of all the people of history, all of the people in the world today, there is another one not like me, not another one like any one of us. We are uniquely, we have, by our background, by our genetic background, all of it, we are all of us equally able to act and react and to have some kind of effect on what is happening in the world in our part of it, where we have something that we can do, someone whom we can be, some way we can affect what's going on. And our responsibility in all of this is to get out and do it and make sure that it's not just to be ranting and raving, and but doing it in a way that shows an effect on us and shows an effect in the way we are treating other people, and as ministers, ways of recognizing people that there isn't anything so special except that we've had some schooling that most people haven't. And have you all had the experience of being at the and I haven't been there for years, maybe they don't do it anymore, when we go down to the ocean in September or October and spend 3 days down, what, Monday, Wednesday until Tuesday? Yeah. And do they still have the same way of wrapping it up with communion, and all of the people, the conference ministers started out, or the people who are in charge of the program started out, we all line up by twos, and after we take communion, the elements are handed to us. The person that is standing directly in front of us and who served us hands the elements to us after we have received, and then we turn around and we serve the people next in the line. Is that familiar to you? Are they still doing that? It's something so that everybody in there is becomes serving and receiving. So it kind of it levels the playing field, if I can use that. And I have done that in churches and asked the congregation to line up like that. And I was just trying to think. I saw just a wonderful comment today about that basically said, why are we so worried about saying that things are holy and so things are of God? Then let's act like it. If we believe that, let's act like it. We don't have to consecrate the elements. We're not doing a consecration, at least not in the sense that I've always, or the understanding of the word consecration. We don't bless things. God blesses things. They are consecrated because they are God's, given to us. They're already, all we can do is share with them and treat them and make that clear that that our role is one that is more to persuade all people to understand that we are all blessed already, and all things that are worth doing start out that way. And if we get a feeling that we're doing something that just doesn't feel like it's a blessing all the way around, then maybe we better start again and think about what we're doing.
Thank you, Andy. The rest of you, do you have a place for an angry Jesus in your faith?
What I really liked about what Andy said is that I guess I need to have a Jesus who whose humanity allows me to understand God better. So that the fullness of that human experience to be honored. I do think, though, that Jesus uses anger differently than I am able to use anger, in that that I think it was not a self-serving anger. It was not an out of control anger. It was, you know, I heard somebody, maybe Lisa, talk about it being a righteous anger. So that he seemed to have an ability to control it better than often I and a lot of other humans are able to do, which elevated it more for me, more than just this is an identifiable trait, but this is sort of how, in the best of times, to use that human trait.
That's fascinating. I always pair this angry Jesus with the angry Jesus who cursed the fig tree, because I think those two angry Jesuses are a contrast to each other, where this is a righteous anger and has an element of the divine of Jesus in his humanity. The cursing the fig tree is just the human Jesus losing it.
Yeah.
And so I often pair these two, but then I also contrast them. So I like that.
And both of those examples are reminders to me. I like that. I remember that class in seminary, the whole discussion about fully human and fully divine, and, you know, the whole one iota and substance. And do you remember those classes were tedious? But it became important to my own walk with God to believe that Jesus was fully human. And perhaps I resonate because I've got a wee bit of an anger problem. So, but I appreciate what both Gail and Lisa said, in that we for what purpose? What was the purpose of our anger? And the two examples that Lisa gave, those are beautiful examples of two different kinds of anger. So when is my anger righteous and for the victim, as opposed to my ego getting in the way? So, but I still go back to it, to answer your question, Gordon. It comforts me, this passage, because it helps me to continue to link Jesus's full humanity.
So as we're comparing and contrasting Jesuses, we know that Jesus spent most of his time preaching about love. I'm really curious for you all how this story helps you understand the relationship between anger and love. Are they opposites, as I so often think we talk about them, or are anger and love somehow connected?
They're absolutely connected, and they're absolutely connected in this passage, because it was his extreme love for those who were being victimized. I think one of the biggest problems that churches, members of churches make, is that they don't stand up to inappropriate behavior. You're supposed to be nice when you go to churches. Now, we've got two interim ministers on this conversation, and that can destroy a church, is when everyone is nice and no one stands up to inappropriate behavior. This is a pivotal point, that bad behavior is bad behavior.
Yes.
And it's out of love that I will claim that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
You're not doing your job if you're not somehow finding some way of dealing with inappropriate behavior, if it includes anger that has no legitimate is more out of a problem that the person is dealing with than that the church is, or that the wider good.
Yeah. It's not that anger can't be an opposite of love at times.
Right.
Because, sometimes anger will lead to violence and
Right.
and inappropriate behavior
Right.
itself. But anger that builds on injustice, opposition to injustice, anger that builds on love for those who are suffering injustice, is a real contrast to anger that is a hatred and a violence.
Right.
So, they say that the real opposite of love is fear.
Fear.
I think there's a feminist critique to that somewhere, that the real opposite of anger is not just fear, but also the inducing of fear. So oppression. And I'm not sure who did that theological work, but I'm sure it's been done somewhere. And I think that's important right now, because I think there are a lot of people who are living in places that are established as temples, homes even, where it's hard to differentiate between love and fear and oppression. And that's one of the groups of people that I'm really concerned about in my own prayers, are the folks who are living in homes where there's violence, in this time when we're semi-confined to our homes. And so I think we need to really focus in on what Jesus' anger is about and what it does, which is to free those who are being exploited, as opposed to lashing out at those who are exploiting.
And you look at the crowd, clearly responded in a positive way. They were spellbound by what happened. And what as this question was sent to us, what it made me think about is that sometimes it is only within the context of love that many of us are able to confront the things we need to be angry about. And so that in that way, I also do not see love and justice or anger being opposing, that it is the fundamental acceptance, as Deborah said, of God for us, that allows us to stretch enough to get angry, to stand up for those who are oppressed.
Well, I'm going to allow that to be our last word in this conversation for the day. Thank you, Gail and Andy and Lisa and Deborah. This conversation has not disappointed.
No, not me either. Yeah.
It's fun.
I want to thank all of those who are watching our roundtable today. I will let you know that tomorrow we will have a new panel with us who will be leading us in a conversation about the Last Supper and foot washing stories. So until then, may you have a blessed Holy Week.
Blessings, everyone.
Aye, blessing.
Mhm.